You want me to skip my mother's funeral? The words felt heavy, unreal. My phone trembled in my hand as her text glared back at me. It's not practical for you to go. My chest tightened, the air growing thin around me. This was supposed to be a moment of unity, of solace. Instead, it felt like betrayal wrapped in indifference. My mother, the one constant in my life, was gone. And somehow, I was being told to stand still, to push my grief aside. I read the text again, hoping I'd misunderstood. Surely there was more to this. A reason, an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. My mind raced through memories of Vanessa's assurances, her promises to always have my back. But those memories clashed against the cold reality of her words. Hours later, I found myself in my car, gripping the steering wheel as silence pressed down on me. The weight of everything, loss, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name, threatened to crush me. Somewhere in the distance, life continued as if nothing had changed. But for me, the ground had shifted. I stared into the darkened sky, waiting for clarity, for strength, and somewhere deep inside, a spark flickered, the beginning of an understanding I wasn't ready to face. Vanessa had always been the kind of woman who commanded attention. She was magnetic, vibrant, a force of nature whose confidence bordered on intoxicating. When we met, I mistook her self-assurance for strength. I thought her decisiveness was the anchor I needed in my otherwise chaotic life. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first sign should have been the way she talked about herself. Always herself. At dinners with friends, conversations bent toward her like iron filings to a magnet. Her achievements, her plans, her struggles. At first I didn't mind. She was dazzling, and I was content to bask in her glow. But over time, I began to notice the glaring absence of reciprocity. My stories, my accomplishments, my emotions, all relegated to background noise in the Vanessa show. But love, as they say, is blind, and I was blind as a bat. The day I told her about my mother's diagnosis was the first time I caught a glimpse of the cracks in her facade. She listened, nodding in all the right places, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted toward the clock, her phone, anywhere but me. I should have known then, but grief has a way of dulling your instincts, and I was desperate to believe she cared. Over the next few months, as my mother's condition worsened, Vanessa's disinterest became harder to ignore. When I spent nights at the hospital, she complained about being lonely. When I canceled dinner plans to take care of my mother, she accused me of neglecting our marriage. Each time, I swallowed my frustration, telling myself she was just adjusting to the circumstances. The breaking point came a week before my mother passed. Vanessa and I sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of an uneaten dinner between us. I'd barely touched my food, my appetite smothered by exhaustion and worry. I told her my mother wasn't getting better, but she responded with exasperation, pointing out how much time I'd been spending at the hospital and how unhealthy it was. She reminded me that I needed to take care of myself too. I told her I was fine, that my mother needed me now more than ever. Her reply stung, a sharp rebuke that made it clear she felt forgotten. She framed it as if I had been neglecting her, insisting that everything lately had been about my mother. A part of me wanted to scream, another part wanted to cry. Instead, I said nothing, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. It was the kind of selfishness you couldn't argue with, a self-centeredness so ingrained that it twisted reality to fit its own narrative. That night, I slept on the couch, not because we'd fought, but because I couldn't stand the thought of lying next to her. The morning after that sleepless night on the couch, the sound of Vanessa's laughter woke me. It rang through the house, light and carefree, as if the tension from the night before had evaporated. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire argument, but the ache in my chest reminded me it was all too real. When I entered the kitchen, she was scrolling through her phone, her legs casually crossed on the chair. A steaming cup of coffee sat in front of her, untouched. She greeted me with a brightness that clashed with my exhaustion, making an offhand comment about how tired I looked. I muttered a brief response and poured myself some coffee, my hands trembling from the stress and lack of sleep. She watched me for a moment before suggesting I take better care of myself. Her tone carried a veneer of concern, but it felt hollow, like a performance. She continued, advising me to take a day off and do something for myself, like going to the gym or getting a massage. I stared into my coffee, watching the steam curl and dissipate. The disconnect between her words and my reality was staggering. My mother was dying, and Vanessa's solution was self-improvement. It was almost laughable. To end the conversation, I mumbled that I would consider it. Her expression brightened, as if she had solved all my problems with that single suggestion. She returned her attention to her phone, leaving me to wrestle with the growing sense of detachment between us. Later that day, as I sat by my mother's bedside, her frail hand in mine, the contrast between the two women in my life became painfully clear. My mother, even in her weakest moments, exuded a quiet strength and selflessness that Vanessa couldn't begin to comprehend. Vanessa's suggestion to take a day for myself felt absurd in the face of what truly mattered. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would endure Vanessa's indifference for now, but I wouldn't let it consume me. My priority was my mother, and once she was gone, I would deal with the wreckage of my marriage, whatever was left of it. The following week was a blur of quiet chaos. Each morning began with the weight of knowing that time was running out for my mother. The hospice staff, kind and efficient, became my temporary family. They offered me gentle reassurances and updates as I navigated the emotional storm that churned inside me. Every moment by her side felt precious and fleeting, and I clung to those hours as if they could somehow slow the inevitable. Vanessa, meanwhile, operated in a world apart. She maintained her usual routine, her focus seemingly untouched by the gravity of what was happening. Occasionally, she would ask if I needed anything, but the question always felt perfunctory, as if it were an obligation rather than genuine care. More often than not, she filled her days with errands, lunches, and scrolling through social media. The dissonance between her life and mine was jarring, a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. One evening, as I returned home from the hospice, the house was eerily quiet. Vanessa wasn't in the living room, and her car wasn't in the driveway. On the kitchen counter, I found a note, a casual explanation that she had decided to spend the evening at a friend's dinner party. There was no acknowledgement of where I'd been, no mention of my mother, no expression of concern. I stood in the kitchen, the note crumpled in my hand, and felt a surge of anger unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't just her absence that stung. It was the audacity of her detachment, the way she seemed to float above the reality I was drowning in. My mother was fading, and Vanessa's world continued to spin untouched. In the days that followed, I found myself withdrawing further. I stopped sharing updates about my mother's condition. I stopped looking for comfort in a woman who clearly couldn't provide it. Instead, I focused on what mattered. Being present for my mother, holding her hand, and letting her know she wasn't alone. Every time Vanessa offered her hollow attempts at support, I nodded politely and let the words wash over me, meaningless and empty. By the end of that week, I realized something profound. The love I had once felt for Vanessa, a love that had been so consuming, so all-encompassing, was eroding. Each act of indifference, each failure to connect, chipped away at the foundation of our relationship. And for the first time, I began to accept a painful truth. The woman I had married was not the partner I needed, not in this moment, and perhaps not ever. The stillness in the house that evening was suffocating, a silence that seemed to mirror the isolation I had come to accept as my normal. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, replaying the past weeks in my mind. Every moment of Vanessa's apathy, every hollow gesture of support, pressed against me like an unrelenting weight. It was as if my grief had become an inconvenience, a burden too cumbersome for her curated world of brunches and spa days. I thought about the conversations I'd had with friends and family, those quiet interventions when they cautiously urged me to take care of myself. They had seen what I refused to acknowledge, that my attempts to shield Vanessa from discomfort had only emboldened her selfishness. My silence had been my complicity. The realization hit like a tidal wave. I had spent years bending to accommodate her needs, sacrificing my own boundaries to keep the peace. And where had it led me? To this moment, where I felt more alone in my marriage than I did sitting by my dying mother's bedside. I recalled my sister's advice from months ago. Her words had been gentle but firm, a reminder that love wasn't meant to be martyrdom. She had urged me to draw lines, to demand the respect I deserved. At the time, I had brushed it off, convinced that Vanessa's intentions were good, that I simply needed to be patient. But now, as the truth settled in, I saw that patience had been my undoing. I stood up, the decision forming with clarity. This was no longer about trying to salvage what was broken. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself that I had given away piece by piece. For too long, I had prioritized someone who couldn't or wouldn't do the same for me. That night, I didn't sleep on the couch. Instead, I sat at the dining table, pen in hand, drafting the first steps of a plan to move forward. It was time to set boundaries, to stop explaining away Vanessa's indifference as anything other than what it was. And it was time to confront her, not with anger or pleading, but with the unshakable resolve to prioritize my well-being. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't joy or even relief, but a quiet determination. The road ahead would be painful and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it would be mine. The confrontation was quieter than I had imagined. Vanessa sat across from me at the kitchen table, her expression somewhere between confusion and irritation. She asked why I seemed so distant lately, why I wasn't as attentive as I used to be. For a moment, I considered sugarcoating the truth, wrapping it in layers of politeness to soften the blow. But I had promised myself honesty, and this was the first step. I told her about the ways her actions, or lack of them, had impacted me. I described the loneliness I had felt, not just in recent weeks, but over the course of our relationship. The weight of always being the one to bend, to compromise, had become unbearable. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift, a flicker of defensiveness followed by something closer to indignation. She tried to interject, to justify her choices, but I held firm. For once, I wasn't asking for her approval or understanding. I was simply stating what I needed: space to grieve, to heal, and to rebuild without the constant tug of her expectations. Vanessa's reaction was predictable. She insisted I was overreacting, that my grief was clouding my judgment. She pointed out all the times she had tried to help, as if her sporadic efforts could outweigh the indifference that had defined her behavior. I listened without responding, her words washing over me without sinking in. In the days that followed, I began taking deliberate steps to create the space I had long needed. I spent more time away from the house, finding solace in the company of friends and family who understood the depth of my loss. I started revisiting hobbies I had abandoned over the years, small acts of reclaiming the person I had been before Vanessa's shadow loomed so large over my life. Each evening I returned home lighter, more certain that the path I was carving was the right one. Vanessa continued to oscillate between attempts to win me back and bouts of frustration at my newfound independence. But I no longer felt the need to placate her, to shrink myself for the sake of maintaining peace. The final turning point came when I packed a bag and left the house for a few nights, staying with a close friend who had offered me their spare room. The physical distance gave me clarity, a chance to see my life from the outside. I realized that this wasn't just about setting boundaries. It was about making a choice, to stay in a relationship that drained me or to step into an unknown future that held the promise of something better. When I returned, Vanessa barely acknowledged my absence. Her dismissal only confirmed what I already knew. It was time to let go of the life I had tried so hard to build with her and embrace the one I deserved. As I walked out the door for the final time, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The pain of ending something familiar was tempered by the hope of a fresh start. Months have passed since that final walk out of our shared home, and the wounds I carried have begun to heal. The pain, once sharp and all-consuming, has dulled into something manageable, a distant ache that reminds me of where I've been and how far I've come. In the time since leaving Vanessa, I have reconnected with the parts of myself that had long been neglected. I spend weekends hiking trails I once loved, the fresh air a balm for my soul. My evenings are filled with laughter and conversation, surrounded by friends and family who had waited patiently for me to return to them. My grief for my mother remains, but it no longer feels like a weight I carry alone. In her absence, I've found a way to honor her memory, not by clinging to the pain of losing her, but by embracing the life she wanted for me, a life filled with purpose, joy, and the kind of love that lifts you up instead of pulling you down. As for Vanessa, her absence has been a blessing in ways I hadn't anticipated. The clarity I gained after leaving her has reshaped how I view relationships. I no longer mistake someone's charm for kindness or their confidence for compassion. I see now that love is a partnership, not a performance. Looking back, I don't regret the years I spent with her. They taught me the importance of self-worth and the danger of losing yourself in the pursuit of someone else's happiness. Those lessons, hard-earned as they were, have become the foundation of the new life I am building. Today, as I stand on the precipice of this new chapter, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Peace. The road ahead is still uncertain, but for the first time, it feels like it belongs to me. And that, more than anything, is a victory worth celebrating.